From that moment on, Cain began to plot how to eliminate Abel, the source of his torment. On what seemed like an ordinary day, Cain invited Abel to take a walk with him in the fields. Abel, unsuspecting and trusting, agreed without hesitation. As they walked along the path to the fields, Abel's thoughts were on his flock, as they always were. When they reached the fields, the surroundings were eerily quiet, save for the rustling of crops in the breeze. Cain looked at Abel, and the malice in his heart reached its peak. His hands trembled slightly, and his eyes burned with resolve. Suddenly, he lunged at Abel, his hands closing tightly around his brother's neck. Abel's eyes widened in shock and terror. He couldn't comprehend that his own brother would do such a thing. He struggled desperately, his hands flailing as he tried to break free from Cain's grip, but it was futile. After God created the world, he formed the first man from the dust of the ground and breathed the breath of life into him, naming him Adam. From Adam's rib, God then created the first woman, Eve. Adam and Eve lived carefree in the Garden of Eden until they succumbed to the serpent's temptation and ate the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Enraged by their disobedience, God banished them from the garden. After being cast out of Eden, Adam and Eve found themselves on barren land, where they began a new life. They built a simple shelter in the wilderness, tilled the soil, and tended to their livestock. Though their days were hard, they did not lose hope and faced each challenge with resilience. As time passed, Eve became pregnant and gave birth to their first son. Gazing at the tiny, wrinkled yet vibrant life in their arms, Adam and Eve were overwhelmed with the joy and excitement of first-time parents. They believed this child was a gift from God and would thrive under their care. They named him Cain, meaning acquired or gotten. As Cain grew, he began helping his parents with farming. He toiled tirelessly on the land, plowing, sowing, and watering day after day. He watched with anticipation as the seeds he planted sprouted and grew. However, the land did not always yield abundantly. Sometimes the scorching sun cracked the earth, making it difficult for seeds to germinate. Other times, heavy rains washed away the fruits of their labor. Yet Cain never gave up. He poured his sweat into the soil, battling the unpredictability of nature. Years later, Eve became pregnant again and gave birth to their second son, whom they named Abel. Abel's personality was quite different from Cain's. While Cain was strong and practical, drawn to working the land, Abel had a deep passion for shepherding. As Abel grew, he took charge of the family's flock. He rose early each morning, leading the sheep to lush pastures where they could graze freely. He cared for each sheep with tenderness, tending to the sick and cradling the lambs in his arms on cold nights, sharing his warmth with them. When the time of harvest came, Cain and Abel each brought offerings to God to express their gratitude and reverence. Cain carefully selected the finest grains and golden stalks from his fields, arranging them neatly on the altar. He felt proud, confident that his hard work would earn God's favor. Abel, on the other hand, chose the healthiest and most perfect lamb from his flock. He slaughtered it and offered the choicest cuts and fat on the altar. His movements were gentle and reverent, as if performing a sacred duty. It was clear from his actions that his heart was pure, filled only with awe and love for God. As the offerings were presented, a divine light descended from the heavens, and the solemn face of God appeared before Cain and Abel. Yet God's gaze rested only on Abel's offering, praising it for its purity and the sincerity of Abel's heart. Cain's offering, however, was ignored, as if a passing breeze had swept it away without a trace. This outcome struck Cain like a bolt of lightning. His hopeful eyes darkened instantly, and a surge of uncontrollable anger welled up within him. His face twisted with jealousy, and his fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. He couldn't understand why God had overlooked his offering despite his hard work, while Abel's had been favored. As he stared at Abel and the lamb that had won God's approval, the flames of jealousy burned fiercely in his heart. Cain even began to question God's fairness, wondering if Abel had somehow manipulated the situation. His thoughts grew more chaotic, and anger consumed his reason. From that day on, Cain's heart was filled with jealousy and resentment. Whenever he looked at Abel, there was no trace of brotherly love in his eyes, only an endless, seething hatred. God saw the change in Cain's heart and issued him a warning. He made it clear to Cain that his anger and jealousy were manifestations of sin. If Cain chose to do what was right, he could still find favor with God. But if he chose to give in to sin, it would lie at his door like a beast, waiting to devour him. However, Cain did not heed God's warning. His heart was already consumed by jealousy and rage, leaving no room for reason or repentance. From that moment on, Cain began to plot how to eliminate Abel, the source of his torment. On what seemed like an ordinary day, Cain invited Abel to take a walk with him in the fields. Abel, unsuspecting and trusting, agreed without hesitation. As they walked along the path to the fields, Abel's thoughts were on his flock, as they always were. When they reached the fields, the surroundings were eerily quiet, save for the rustling of crops in the breeze. Cain looked at Abel, and the malice in his heart reached its peak. His hands trembled slightly, and his eyes burned with resolve. Suddenly, he lunged at Abel, his hands closing tightly around his brother's neck. Abel's eyes widened in shock and terror. He couldn't comprehend that his own brother would do such a thing. He struggled desperately, his hands flailing as he tried to break free from Cain's grip. But it was futile. Cain's mind was consumed by one thought: to make Abel disappear. When Abel's struggles finally ceased, Cain released his grip. He looked down at his brother's lifeless body, feeling no remorse, only a twisted sense of satisfaction. The fields and the sky remained unchanged, as if nothing had happened. Cain dug a hole, buried Abel's body, and covered the bloodstains with dirt. He thought his crime was hidden, but God had seen it all. God was filled with righteous anger at Cain's actions. He confronted Cain, asking, "Where is your brother Abel?" Cain's heart raced, but he tried to feign ignorance, replying coldly, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" God's voice thundered with fury as he declared, "What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. The earth has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. Now you are cursed and banished from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Terror and despair filled Cain's heart as he heard God's judgment. He knew he could no longer live peacefully on the land or enjoy the fruits of his labor. He would forever carry the weight of his sin, condemned to be an outcast, forever exiled from the presence of others. So Cain left the land he had once called home and began his endless journey of exile. He wandered through barren deserts, climbed treacherous mountains, and trekked through dense forests. With every step, he felt as though he could hear Abel's blood crying out from the ground, a haunting sound that followed him relentlessly, tormenting his soul. His footsteps were heavy and lonely, his heart filled with regret and despair. When Adam and Eve learned of Abel's death, they were utterly heartbroken. They could never have imagined such a tragedy unfolding between their two sons. Eve wept day and night, blaming herself for failing to raise Cain properly and for not nurturing a bond of brotherly love between her sons. Adam, too, was consumed by guilt, feeling that he had failed as a father to fulfill his responsibilities. During his years of exile, Cain endured immense suffering. Without a permanent home, he wandered aimlessly, his food sources uncertain and often scarce. Many nights he lay on the cold ground, staring at the star-filled sky, overwhelmed with regret. He remembered the days of his childhood, playing with Abel, when their lives were filled with innocence and joy. But now, all of that was gone. As time passed, a subtle change began to take place in Cain's heart. He started to reflect on his actions, realizing how foolish his jealousy and hatred had been. He longed for God's forgiveness and dreamed of returning to the warmth of his family. Yet he knew his sin was too great, and such hopes were nothing more than wishful thinking. Eventually, Cain arrived in the land of Nod, east of Eden, and settled there. He built a simple shelter from stones and mud, attempting to start a new life. However, he could never escape the weight of God's curse or the guilt he carried for Abel. Every night, he was haunted by dreams of Abel, his eyes filled with pain and accusation. Because of God's curse, no matter how hard Cain toiled, the land refused to yield its bounty. His crops withered, his fruits rotted, and survival became a daily struggle. He began to doubt whether he could even continue to live on this land. Yet God did not entirely abandon Cain. Seeing Cain's constant fear of being killed by those who might seek vengeance, God extended a measure of mercy. He promised Cain that anyone who killed him would suffer sevenfold retribution. Moreover, God placed a protective mark on Cain, a sign that would shield him from harm. This mark, however, also made him an outcast. Whenever people saw Cain, they avoided him, as if he carried an aura of doom. Cain lived a solitary life in the land of Nod. Not long after, his wife became pregnant and gave birth to a son named Enoch. Cain decided to build a city in Nod and named it after his son, Enoch. He hoped this city would become a place of refuge and prosperity for him and his descendants, a place where they could escape the shadow of sin and suffering. Yet Cain could never shake the fear of God or the guilt he felt for Abel. He knew his sin could never be erased, and his descendants would forever bear the mark of his crime. In his later years, Cain often sat alone on a hillside outside the city, gazing at the distant sky. His heart was heavy with remorse and pain, but he also knew there was no turning back. He would spend the rest of his days in this unfamiliar land, living out his life in solitude.